Hey little girl, welcome to the big, bold, and sometimes bad world. For you, however, your world is going to be pretty small. You may feel like it's big, but trust me, it's really small. You will live your life in a space of about 20 feet by 10 feet. It's all you'll ever know. So for you, it'll be normal. But you need to know there's a much bigger world out there. Just keep that in mind. There's another thing you need to know. You are entering into what we're going to call a settler's life. That is, since this little rectangular space you'll live in is all you'll know, you'll begin to think that everyone's life is the same. That this is what we call normal. And anyone else who deviates from this settler way of life should be viewed with suspicion. Another thing, you are soon going to become aware of something called the pecking order. The pecking order is the way of life for hens. And oh, by the way, that's what you'll be called once you grow up in a few months. Now, as a hen, you will be a part of this pecking order, which is actually a socialization game where others put you in your place and you attempt to put others in their place. It's all a rather silly game, but it is the game you will all play. Every day will be filled with others putting you in your place and you attempting to put others in their place. What's that? Why is it silly? Good question. It's silly because you're only chickens. You're truly not in charge of anything or anyone. Okay now, run along and have a good life. We're here in front of the county courthouse, and the reason we want to be here is because what we want to talk about today has to do with judgment. And man, does judgment happen here, right? And we want it to happen here. Whether it's the judge himself that hears a case and decides for a potential victim or an accuser, or it's the panel of peers that we say need to make the decisions for people, and they decide big things. They decide things about their entire lives. Well, it was a setting kind of like that. It was actually in the courts of the Jewish temple where we pick up Jesus' story. He's been over to the Mount of Olives, and he has returned back to the temple. And this is a story you've probably heard before. It's recorded in John chapter 8, and so you'll have the chance to read it. I'm going to give you the paraphrased version of it, and you can read it in your notes. But Jesus returns to the temple courts, and all of a sudden there's this huge commotion. And the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, drag this woman in and throw her at his feet. Now, we don't know for sure what it exactly looked like, but there's a decent chance that she was either naked or barely clinging to a sheet. It was an embarrassing moment. It says it was done in front of a crowd. Can you imagine? Now, when you come here, and if you happen to be accused and you come into this building, there will be a crowd of people, but my guess is you're not going to be clinging to a sheet at best. So this is a rare moment. And this is all being done because supposedly they're concerned about this woman, right? She was, as they said, caught in the act of adultery. Now, these guys were experts on the law. They were the ultimate judges, and they knew that about themselves. They were arrogant. They're going to end up asking Jesus, after telling him she was caught in the act, meaning we've already determined she's guilty. Now it's just the sentencing. They know what the sentence is supposed to be according to the Old Testament. But now they put her before him and say, so what do you say? Now, see, what they think is, they know Jesus knows the law. They've been spying on him long enough to know that. But they also know that he has something we're going to call kryptonite. And the kryptonite around his neck is compassion. Last weekend we talked about how compassion was really unheard of before Jesus came onto this earth. But when he came, he brought a clear understanding of what compassion is. So these guys have him trapped. right? I mean, he's between a rock and a hard place. Does he choose the law, which they're all supposed to live by, or does he choose compassion, which means that changes the sentencing? What will he do? This is a story about justice. It's a story about judgment. And these guys believe they've got him. Well, you know the rest of the story most likely, but let me finish it. So they stepped back and they just watched. They probably had smirks on their faces and were elbowing each other saying, he's done now. This will end any thought of him having a following. And then Jesus does the unthinkable, the unpredictable. He bends over and he writes in the sand. See, these guys all had their rocks. The law required she be stoned to death, and it was going to be a quick, sentencing and life over. That's how quick they wanted this. But see, she was just a pawn. She was just a patsy. He was the big catch. He was the big fish they were after. So when he sits down, he kneels down and writes in the sand, we don't know what he wrote. Everybody wants to know. But what he wrote changed her life. Literally. We talked last week about game-changing moments. What a game-changing moment in her life. He writes in the sand, and then he stands up again, and he asks them, if you have not committed a sin, feel free to throw those rocks at this woman. And he gets down and he writes again, and you know what happens. One by one, it's a huge rock drop. Not a mic drop, as we've talked about before, but a rock drop. And they leave. And then he turns to her and says, where are your accusers? I mean, the courthouse has emptied out. Where are they? Where are those who want to condemn you? And that's a key phrase, who want to condemn you. And she says, I don't know. I don't know where they went. And he says, I'm not here to condemn either. And it's at that moment, he then gives her some instruction about, now change what you're doing so you don't end up in a place like this. But what's intriguing to me is this. Why did he wait until the very end of the story, very end of the scenario, to address the one who was supposedly guilty? He waited to the end. It was like a postlude. Oh, by the way, don't sin anymore. But the real action took place in the middle of the story. The writing, the sending, the dropping of stones. You know the story. You've got the judges, you've got the woman caught in adultery, you've got the writing in the sand, the dropping of the rocks, and the acquittal of the accused. For our purposes, I want you to see those guys who'd been spying on Jesus, who had a real distaste for him. We're going to see them as the gathering of hens. I know hens are females, but this story is not about the gal. It's really not, is it? It's about the guys. The guys who would play the role of catching Jesus and using this woman. They saw her as trash, using her for their purposes. That's what this is all about. The hens had gathered and they had started to pick away. And Jesus, unfortunately for them, is not a hen. We're all hens. We really are. He is not a hen. He sounded like a hen. He kind of looked like a hen, but looks can be deceiving, can't they? He's not a hen at all. Well, I want you to think of this as the pecking order. A story about judgment is oftentimes a story about a pecking order. That phrase came to the world by a guy who was a Norwegian zoologist and psychologist. And in 1921, he coined the phrase. And the phrase refers to a hierarchical societal system by which we place value on people. In India, they call it the caste system, but that's something you're born into. This is something that happens based on your actions, based on what people think of you. Judgment, in essence, is a decision on the value of the person before you. And Jesus says, this woman, no matter how much you want to treat her like trash, is of such great value that I will land on compassion for her. And so Jesus, although he looked like a hen to them, was no hen at all. In fact, you kind of see this with Jesus and these hens. He kind of, it's almost like Wile E. Coyote. You know the old cartoon? Every time they try to blow him up with Acme dynamite, it ended up back in their face. You know, the feathers flying. And it happened again. Because as much as they thought he was just a hen, he is far more than a hen. And his ideas on judgment and his ideas on this hierarchical system in which we live transformed the world. Well, we're here at Fort Uncompahgre. I don't know if you've ever been here. It's in Delta, and it's kind of an amazing place. This is a replica of what was here back in the 1820s. Can you believe that? Somewhere between 1820 and the 1840s, what happened is they had this place as a trading depot for like beaver furs and things like that. And sometime in the 1840s, the Ute Indians came in and attacked, and you can guess it, they needed to move on. But I'm here because it reminds me of the series that we're in. It's time that we get back to that series. We're calling it The Father's Business. And if you don't remember, that's a line Jesus used. It's something he said when he was 12 years old, when he said to his parents, I got to be about my Father's business. In other words, pleasing you is no longer the most important thing to me. It'll now be purely about pleasing my Father. And we've decided that's a great approach to life. The book of Hebrews calls Jesus the pioneer of our faith. In other words, not only was he the exact representation of God, but he showed us the way and how to live this life in a way that God wants us to live it, that honors him the most. And so we're taking the book of Luke and we're seeing what the Father's business really looks like. So we've used this pioneer idea because he is the pioneer of our faith. And we've talked about the fact, if you haven't been with us, that there are pioneers in life and then there are settlers in life. And the truth of the matter is, most of us, if we're honest, tend to lean towards being settlers. It's safer, you know, it's fairly predictable, if you will, and it's comfortable. And I'll tell you what, I don't know too many people that don't want to be comfortable, but that's really not the life of the pioneer. You seldom see Jesus settling and saying, let's just do the easy thing. And so that's what we're doing. We're following him. Now, going along with kind of the theme that we've got going today is the idea that chickens are not pioneers. I don't know how else to put it. I don't mean to hurt any chicken feelings. Bless their hearts, their little beady hearts. But they are not pioneers. Chickens settle in, and their life, as we mentioned, is basically, at least at our house, a 10-foot by 20-foot existence. Now, they may not know that, but they have settled in. Most of us, as settlers, don't realize that we have settled in. And so have we become the kind of people who have settled in, and really judging one another is a value of settlers, to be honest with you. So we're going to pick up the story with Jesus. We last left off in Luke chapter 6, and we're going to go back to Luke chapter 6, and I'm going to read to you from verses 37 and 38, and then I want to comment on that, and then we'll go on to the rest of the verses. So out of the NIV, it reads like this: Do not judge others, and you will be not judged. Do not condemn others, or it will all come back against you. Forgive others, and you will be forgiven. Give, and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full. Pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. Okay, let's take a break right there. I have a question for you, because he says something that we all probably have kind of a different take on, and that is, don't judge or you'll be judged. So what is judge? What is it to judge? What is judgmentalism all about? Is it as simple as observing what's going on around you and determining whether or not you think it's appropriate or it's the best way to do life? You know, if we have a biblical perspective on life, we're actually called to do that. And we'll talk more about that, but we're actually called to observe what's going on around us and make sure that we choose the path that is more the path that Jesus would take. So if judging others is not simply just observing what's going on and seeing, well, is this biblical or is it not? Is this what Jesus would do or is it not? What is it? I want to suggest to you that being judgmental is entering into a process, and that process kind of has a three-step, approach. The first one is simple. It's criticism. It's just simple criticism. We all do it. It goes on in our culture all the time. The second part of that is contempt. Now you're not satisfied to just say something about somebody that you don't like. Now you start to not like them so much as a person, and you have a difficult time loving them. And then finally it arrives at this place of condemnation. And you might remember that when we were talking about Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, remember how he ended it? He asked her, he said, where are those who condemned you? Meaning they judged you. I mean, they had a problem with you. They had a problem with what you did, but ultimately they wanted your demise is the idea. So let's start with criticism. Like I said, it's everywhere. Whether you get on the internet or you get on television shows, whatever the case may be, there's criticism everywhere. Let's turn to some comedians who help us understand how criticism is kind of working. First of all, a guy by the name of Daniel Tosh put it this way: honest criticism is hard to take, whether it comes from relatives or friends or acquaintances or strangers. In other words, no one wants to be criticized by anybody, but it comes from all those angles. And then one of my favorite comedians, Stephen Wright, put it this way: for every action, there is an opposite and equal criticism. And that says it all. No matter what you do. I mean, the Son of God was criticized, right? The greatest pioneer ever known to man was criticized for things he said and for things he did. And so what I want to do, though, before we move on out of that passage, is look at verse 38, because I think what has happened, and this is my personal opinion, I'm sharing with you, free of charge, is that verse 38 is most often taken out of context. That's the verse that says, give and you will receive. Give and it'll be given back to you is the idea. Right there, most people take that verse and they say, well, this is about money. And we as pastors are the worst. We as teachers tend to say, here's the chance to take this verse and make it about, you should be giving more money. If you give more money, then you'll get more money and you'll get richer is the idea. But what we fail to do, and what we talk about all the time, is leave it in context. And the context, if you look at that passage there in Luke chapter 6, it's about how we treat others. It's about our relationships with each other. Now, why would Jesus divert from a conversation, judge or you'll be judged? That's about relational skills, relational decisions. Why would he divert for just a second and say, oh, that reminds me of money, and then go back to the relational things? I think it's within the scope of relationships. I think what he's saying is to judge is to actually take from people. It's to take their value. To criticize, to show contempt, to condemn others is to take from them. Instead, why don't you give to them? And you'll find that life gives back to you because of the approach you're taking. I just wanted to mention that and challenge you to think in those terms, all right? And maybe it's my own personal repentance for ever taking that verse and saying, this is all about money. Now, again, I think most people will say it's all about money. I think in context, it's all about relationships. Okay, let's move on. Verse 39. Then Jesus gave the following illustration, and there's actually three. He goes on, he says, can one blind person lead another? Won't they both fall into a ditch? Students are not greater than their teacher, but the student who is fully trained will become like his teacher. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own eye? How can you think of saying, friend, let me help you with that speck in your eye, when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. Hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, then you'll see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Okay, so let's look at these three illustrations quickly. Okay, one right after the other. In typical Jesus fashion, I mean, he just says, I'm going to give you a picture of what this tends to look like, this judgmental process. All right. First of all, he says, think about a blind person who goes down and gets a blind seeing eye dog. Okay?
aren't they both going to fall into, the ditch, into the river? We're not far from the river. Aren't they both going to fall into there? The ridiculous nature of that. He says, this is what we're talking about when you judge someone else. The second illustration is about thinking that we're more knowledgeable, we're more important than our teacher. All right. And the third illustration is about the idea that criticizing other people for small things in their life, when in fact, those are huge issues in our own life, is actually comical. And that's how Jesus approaches this whole thing. All right. So I want to start with a caveat before we go deeper into those things. And the caveat is this, that Jesus is not saying that we should not be discerning. All right, that'd be contrary to other things that he says. Let me give you an example of this. Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Watch this line. By their fruit you will recognize them. And again, at the end of this passage, verse 20, he says, so again, by their fruit you will recognize them. What is he saying? He's saying, pay attention to what's going on around you. And be discerning, because there's people that want to lead you places. You should pay attention because you probably should be following those people. That's discernment. So when he says, judge not lest you be judged, he's not saying don't be discerning. He absolutely wants us to be discerning. Again, in Matthew chapter 10, I'm sending you out, he says to his disciples, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Shrewd as snakes. That's, again, a metaphor for the idea of, put your mind to work and think clearly about the fact that there are people around you that you best not follow. You best not pay attention to their conversation that leads you astray, is the idea. Paul even talked a lot about this. Let me just take two passages. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, he says, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. How would you know that it's bad company unless you're discerning? And then he even speaks about those in leadership in the church, that what they do matters, and you should pay attention to what they're doing. He says this as he writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:20. He says, but those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove before everyone so that others may take warning. See, anything but, telling us to not be discerning and not pay attention. When Jesus says, judge not, he's not talking about that at all. In fact, the rest of the New Testament is filled with examples of the phrase admonish one another. 1 Thessalonians 5:14, Romans 15:14, Colossians 3:16. Admonish one another. That is, say some hard things to people that are true because you care about them. That means you're being discerning. Okay? It's different than judging. You're not moving from criticism to ultimately condemnation of people. And that's really important. And you got to be really careful, because if you start looking around the culture for people to follow, there's a lot of people that want you to follow them. Hollywood celebrities and professional athletes would love for you to take their advice. Years ago, when we were in college in the Midwest in Joplin, Missouri, which is, by the way, the buckle of the Bible Belt, it's just a church on every corner. While we were there, they invited Alice Cooper to come to a concert. Now, to younger people in this listening audience or viewing audience, that name doesn't mean anything, but those of us who are a little bit older, you might remember the concerts that Alice Cooper would put on. And in the middle of it, he did just crazy things, insane things. Like one of the things he did was he bit the heads off chickens, which goes along with what we're talking about. He bit the heads off chickens, and so we decided, a bunch of us college kids decided to go protest the concert. It was held in Memorial Hall, the greatest gathering place in Joplin, Missouri, and we just stood across the street and we just held up signs and said, we don't think he should be here. Well, we didn't think much more about it. A couple of weeks later, we were listening to the Casey Kasem show. Do you remember that? Like the top 50, songs. And he would do interviews, and he interviewed Alice Cooper. I remember us all gathering in one of our dorm rooms and saying, I wonder what Alice Cooper's going to say. And he talked about us. He said, those college students, those Christian college students that were opposing me when I was in Joplin, Missouri, he says, I'll tell you something. He said, my dad's a pastor, and I know Scripture. And Scripture says, judge not lest you be judged. Was he right? I mean, really, did he have a point? Did we need to rethink whether or not we opposed the kind of behavior he was putting out there for everybody? Well, the bottom line is, and here's the good news about this story. He's a different kind of guy now. I have a friend who met him and said he's one of the nicest guys he's ever met. He plays on the PGA Tour as an amateur sometimes. He's an amazing golfer. So it begs the question, though, is that judging or is that being discerning? Well, let's bring some clarity to this and kind of wrap this thing up. So what is this all about? What are these illustrations that Jesus is using, saying? I think very clearly it is about the fact that when we choose to jump into that process in relationship to other people, the process of criticism and then contempt and then condemnation, he's saying that is foolish. That is a foolish way to see it. I don't know any other way to look at these three illustrations and not come away with such foolishness. I mean, to the point where it's almost comical. You know, who would go find, if you don't have sight, if you're sight impaired, who would go looking for someone else, or like I said earlier, a seeing eye dog to help you get around in the city? You'd be foolish to do that. What student is so foolish as to say, I know more than my teacher? I know a lot of teachers. I really do know a lot of teachers, and a lot of them say, I think I have some students like that. They think they know more than I do. And then ultimately, what kind of a person looks at other people and sees big issues in their life, which are actually not that large, and they are overlooking those very same issues in their own life? The way Jesus puts it is that, this is comical. You have made such a fool of yourself that it's comical. So don't even enter into this whole process, is what he's saying. Let's go back to the whole pecking order thing. Remember we talked when we were at the courthouse about the pecking order, that hens have this pecking order, but not just hens. In our society today, there is this hierarchical societal system in which we live, and we tend to place value on people and judge other people, which means take from them their value. And Jesus says instead, give to them. So what is this all about? Well, this pecking order is for chickens. It really is. It's not for people who are pioneers. Settlers and the folks around here on this very ground, they may have wanted to settle here, but they had to move on. They had to become more pioneer than settler, even on this. Criticism is an opinion about somebody based on actions that we don't approve of, or words, or whatever we don't approve of somebody else. When that moves into contempt, we now place their value as lower than ourselves. And we place them in a position where we're not giving to them, but we're taking value from them. And this all works into this idea of the pecking order. It's not just chickens that have a pecking order. I think Jesus is kind of clear about the fact that he didn't like the fact that humans had a pecking order. And you see this in his interactions with the Jewish leaders all the time. But in our society today, we may not live in a space of 10 feet by 20 feet, but we have a pecking order, don't we? And Jesus has no use for it whatsoever. I want to go back to that idea of the log in our own eye while looking at the speck in someone else's eye. Last week I ran across a story, and these are unbelievable times, right? People are just gripped with fear, and there's a lot of people that are starting to look at others. You see this social pressure. You get on social media, and this social pressure for us all to conform, and we have a problem with anybody that doesn't conform, and so we begin to criticize them, and we probably have contempt for them eventually if they don't conform. There's an interesting story out of Kentucky last week about a doctor by the name of John Rademacher. Now, I think maybe after this event, his name should be changed to John Ragemaker. So he's an anesthesiologist, and he's out for a walk. I think it was with his wife, I'm not sure. But he sees a group of teenagers gathered in a park, and he becomes furious, enraged. It might be one thing to just say, I don't think those kids should be together right now. Instead, he goes over there and he starts cursing at them, starts pushing them around, and he actually, and this was caught on video, so it's not just hearsay, he actually began to choke the throat of one girl. Well, he was eventually arrested, as you can imagine, since it was on videotape. But isn't that a great illustration of what we're talking about here? To judge is really the process of saying, you know what, not only do I not like what you do, but I find a problem with you. And in fact, I'm going to make sure you pay the penalty. Condemnation is the idea. And the irony, the comical part of this, which in this story is actually really sad, the comical part, though, that Jesus was talking about is, here's this guy that was so sure that he was righteous and that he had no issues. The issues are with everybody else, that he ends up doing the very thing he was accusing them of. I mean, when you go to somebody and push them in this day and age and put your hands around their neck, there was no mention that he had gloves on or a mask. I don't know if he did or not. But talk about violating social, distancing guidelines. But he felt fine about it. That's what happens to us. When we become judgmental, we enter into this process and we end up looking so foolish. I would think that that guy losing his mind, I don't know what's going to happen to him. He's going to spend time in jail. But I would think that he'd be embarrassed. His family would be embarrassed. And that's what happens to us. That's why Jesus said, relationally speaking here, don't do this. Don't enter into this ugly process that ends up you condemning others. You're going to look like the fool yourself. You're going to be the hen that has all the feathers ripped off you, and you're going to be naked before the world, to go back to that analogy with a woman caught in adultery. So let's kind of bottom line this thing, okay? Are we making fools of ourselves, number one, by the fact that we're looking for problems in other people? Are we making fools of ourselves by thinking we know more than the teacher? Jesus is the ultimate teacher, right? He was the perfect man. He was the smartest man that ever lived. And obviously he's the greatest teacher that ever lived. And he was much more than that, but he was at least that, right? And so do we think that we're smarter than him? That we can go ahead and just keep doing what we're doing? And then finally, are we making such fools of ourselves like this good doctor in Louisville, Kentucky, that now people look at us and go, what is your problem? He says, my people in my kingdom won't live that way. They won't act that way. So I want to go back to, now wrapping it all up, the bottom line. And the bottom line is there is a judge, but there is only one judge. And you know it's not you, and you know it's not me. The bottom line is there's one teacher, one judge. It's not us. John chapter 5, verse 22. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. How foolish for us to think that we're the Son. That we are more than just chickens, really. Shall we do away with the whole pecking order thing? That'd be a great place to start, I think. Ready?
Yeah.
This book is called Chicken Little. Chicken Little. Here we go. Once upon a time, there was a sweet hen named Chicken Little. She lived on a shady lane in a quiet kingdom close to all her friends. One day, as Chicken Little walked past a big oak tree, a strong gust of wind rustled the branches. An acorn was blown loose, and it fell right on Chicken Little's head. It gave her quite a scare. "The sky is falling," she squawked. "The sky is falling. I must tell the king. He'll know what to do." And so Chicken Little ran down the lane toward the king's castle. Oh, there's the hound. That's a hound dog. Can you say hound dog?
Hound dog.
Hound dog. The hound sniffed the entrance of the fox's den. Then they sniffed Chicken Little and our friends. "What are you doing here?" asked one of the hounds. "Please take us to see the king," Chicken Little pleaded. "We must tell him the sky is falling." The hounds had never heard of a sky falling. However, the king was a very smart man, so the hounds were sure he could know what to do. The hounds led the fine feathered friends back to the castle. Do you see the castle?
Yeah.
There's the castle. That's his house. The birds were brought before the king, who was curious to know why they had traveled so far. "Well, hello, Chicken Little," said the king. "I've heard that you've traveled a great distance to see me." "Oh, your majesty," cried Chicken Little, "we've come to warn you that the sky is falling." "Well, how do you know that the sky is falling?" asked the king. I felt it on my head, Chicken Little claimed. I hear it with my own eyes. I saw it with my own ears. Or my own eyes and something like that. Well, where were you when this happened? The king asked. I was walking past a big oak tree. Then it got really windy and a piece of the sky fell on my head. And did any pieces of the sky fall on you as you traveled there? No, Chicken Little replied. Well, what about you? The king asked Henny Penny. Did you feel, see, or hear the sky fall? No, your majesty, said the Henny Penny. I heard it from Chicken Little. And what about you? The king asked the other birds. I heard it from Turkey Lurkey, said the Goosey Lucy. And I heard it from Henny Penny, said Turkey Lurkey. Well, the king said, it seems to me that the sky is not falling. In fact, there is a very simple explanation. The birds twittered excitedly. They knew the king would figure out what was going on. It wasn't a piece of the sky that fell on your head. It was merely an acorn. The birds couldn't believe it. Was all this panic really caused by a single acorn? They asked the king how he figured it out. Well, because Chicken Little was standing under an oak tree on a windy day, the king replied. We're almost done, this last page. Oh, look, the birds all laughed. Can you laugh with the birds? They were so happy that the sky wasn't falling. Before the birds went back home, the king gave Chicken Little an umbrella. Do you see the umbrella? Right there. Yeah. From that day forward, she always carried the umbrella while she walked around. And if acorns fell, Chicken Little didn't mind one bit.
Those pictures.
And then there's more pictures. But that's the end. Did you like that story?
Yeah.
That's a good story, isn't it?
Well, I thought it was appropriate since we started with a little chicken, then with Chicken Little. The deal with the little chicken is she's going to grow up and she's going to get into that whole pecking order thing. The problem with Chicken Little is that Chicken Little, as you know by now, is the story of a little chicken that felt like everything in the world was falling apart. The sky was falling. And that phrase has become famous. When people feel like everything's falling apart and there's no hope and they're scared, kind of like now, we're kind of like Chicken Little. Now the truth of the matter is, I didn't want to tell Keaton this, but this is the G version of this story. The older versions, when Chicken Little and the other birds meet the fox, it's not good. The fox actually succeeds in destroying them. All right, not a happy ending. They never find their way to the king. But there's something in that we need to learn. And that is that you got to be careful who you listen to, number one. You got to be very careful who you follow. We talked about that earlier. It's called discernment. But ultimately, what you want to do is find your way to the king. And when you find your way to the king, you have found your way to the one who totally understands what's going on in life and totally wants to protect you. Just like in the end, this king protected the little chicken. So take it for what it's worth. As we go through this really strange time, be careful who you listen to. Don't buy into the sky is falling, and make your way to the king.